Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And just as a reminder, we're moving to this new, you can hear my dog in the background there. Somebody delivered a package. So we're changing the format of this show. You have been giving your feedback. It sounds like you guys really like the change up, but we're going to be doing more of a co-host sort of format. Not going to have completely different guests every week. You're going to see some of my favorite people repeated as co-hosts rather than as interviewees. We'll preserve the interviewing function of the show. So if there's somebody who we really want to interview, then it'll be one of these fine ladies who has been co-hosting, interviewing alongside with me. And with that, I'd like to introduce Erielle Davidson. You would have seen her on High Noon long ago, but she was clerking for the Second Circuit of Appeals in New York, and therefore not able to share her expertise and her political opinions. But now she is. Can you remind me what the name of the law firm is that you work for?
Yes, I work for a firm that's based out of DC and Virginia called Holtzman Vogel. We do constitutional law, election law, mostly on the right. It's a great place to be. I've only been there for a brief period of time now, but it's been a great time so far. So.
Yeah, and she's speaking here in her personal capacity, but she's now allowed to do that once again, because if you're a federal employee, yes, as many people know, even in your personal capacity, you are not allowed to comment on politics, especially domestic politics. And we do actually have some domestic politics to talk about today, but first, it's impossible to talk about anything with regard to the situation in this country or in the world without reference to the war in Gaza and the coming after, of course, this devastating attack on October 7th that was absolutely savage towards Israeli civilians, men, women, and children, over 200 of whom are still hostages in Gaza as these hostilities continue. But I kind of wanted to start actually at home with that, because there's plenty to say about the world, including the only 14 countries in the UN that didn't vote for this Hamas supporting ceasefire idea, as though any country that had suffered this level of attack should immediately turn around and be talking peace. We would not be talking about this in the context, I don't think, of any other country. But there's been this global reaction. As Israel does step up its effort to actually eliminate Hamas, there was sort of this period in between where there was planning. It sounds now they are putting boots on the ground in Gaza. There is this more coordinated response, and the world, with the world including the United States and cities in the United States, have responded with massive and sometimes very scary protests. Like, for example, in London, you have more than 100,000 people marching with pro-Hamas signage and chants, sometimes overtly anti-Semitic signage and chants. Again, there's this video that's gone viral from Dagestan with people running around in a airport, breaking through the barriers at the airport just to get their hands on what they think might be a Jew. With a plane landing from Israel, which in fact was full of apparently of patients that had been treated in Israel and not actually Israelis. So this is, I guess I would call it an attempted pogrom. And then the scariest part to me is that these kinds of protests are not just in the Arab world and Muslim world, not just in even Western Europe, where I think people on the right have long warned, and not just people on the right, people like Quellebec, right, that there is such a high level of unassimilated migration from North African countries, from Muslim countries, from the Arab world, that there is effectively a large percentage of the population there that is not effectively French or German or British, right? But even here in the United States, we do see this kind of unholy alliance between native-born, far left decolonializers who have this abstract reasoning, abstract sort of political reason for supporting this, and then recent arrivals who have a much more seemingly lizard brain reason for supporting this. So what is your take of just laying out the last week? What's your take on where all of this is going? Because these protests don't seem to be fading out. They seem to be getting bigger. The ones this past weekend in New York seemed bigger than the ones a week ago. But maybe that's just anecdotal. I don't know.
Well, I feel as if you're living inside my brain, Inez, because the term "unholy alliance" is the phraseology that I've been thinking of and using in commonplace when discussing sort of the marriage between the far left and or at least the marriage between the anti-Semitism of the academic left and the anti-Semitism of the Arab world. And I think what's allowed this symbiotic relationship to grow is that you have this racialized perception of the world through the lens of oppressor and oppress, and it finds really firm footing in the Arab narrative vis-a-vis Jews. And so you find that these two pockets of individuals seem to really have a common shared hatred, effective hatred of Jews. And I think the one that stems from the Arab world is quite different than the academic one, but nonetheless, the outcome is the same, right? The outcome is still defending the beheading of babies and women and children and men, and also defending the rape of women and children. And just, the horrific massacre acts that many reporters and journalists have seen on video, and we've actually seen leaked onto social media. And so in terms of what that means and like where we go from here, I think that this signals to me, at least, and probably others as well, that there's a real death of liberalism on the global left. Liberalism used to be kind of this two-prong approach, right? Like equality before the law was one element. And then the second element was making an effort to mitigate social and economic disparities. And I think what has happened as of late is that the latter goal of eliminating disparities has completely subsumed any sort of notions of individual equality. And so, yeah, I think there is an element of this that how are we going to crawl ourselves out of this hole? Well, I credit you tremendously with being one of the loudest voices of saying we should defund the universities, we should go after their endowments, we should destroy them. This may be the bullet that takes out the universities, and God bless it if that's the case. I think that there really is something pernicious in academia that's actually preventing us from really creating an educated class of citizens. We're just creating, an activist class of citizens. And as a Jew, it's been alarming I found it alarming to see these protests taking place on college campuses. I would love to say I'm surprised, but as you and I both know, I'm not. I saw this for quite some time when I was TAing at Stanford Business School. We had some incidents there when I was also in law school. I mean, this has been something that has been brewing for quite some time. And so I'm not surprised. I'm sad. I'm disappointed. I'm angry. But shock is not one of the emotions I'm feeling.
Yeah, I've been saying if you're totally shocked by this, I mean, I think there are elements that are surprising. Actually, the way I was putting it to a friend is, 10 years ago on campus, all of this was there, but they would have been more careful to say Zionist rather than Jew.
Yeah,
it's
now
all
they
the
don't
same
care.
things, right? Yeah, now they don't care, but
They don't care.
and they'll actually just put in Jew into the chants, right? But I think 10 years ago they would have been more careful to say Zionist, which we all know what that meant to begin with, but they're more open about it now. It's interesting. I was listening to the commentary podcast, and because they have up-to-date sort of coverage of what's going on because they do it every day. They're definitely sort of to the left of me generally, but I found them useful in this. And I think John Podhoretz was bringing up something I didn't know. So I knew that Camus and I never know if it's Camus or Camille or the French. Camus would be the good old fashioned American way to say his name.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
was gonna say, it's fine. I grew up on
we're
Wonder Bread.
gonna call him Camus for now on.
Okay, that's fine.
And sorry to any of my French listeners, apologies. No, but that the split between Sartre and Camus actually happened over something really this issue, right? The idea of quote unquote decolonization and incorporating sort of these third world, sometimes colonial rebellions, sometimes just sort of ethnic strife, ethnic cleansing, incorporating that and folding it into the new left as quote unquote decolonialization. And apparently, at that point, Sartre was still very much on board, and Camille was like, "No, my French mother lives in Algiers. What you're talking about is, stirring up ethnic, hatreds and okaying the murder of my mother." And that's where he's like started. That's because I knew that he had split, and not for nothing. I mean, I think he was the best of the existentialists in many ways, and anyway, but not for nothing. But this split him from sort of his other hard left colleagues, and that it was this issue that has to be some end to this philosophical project that you still have to find a way to justify. Like, if you are finding a way to justify these kinds of atrocities in very like real world space, you have jumped from the faculty lounge into something much, much uglier. And I think that is kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And as like you're saying, I don't think it's surprising, but it is something to watch, right? These people,
yeah.
and I understand why people have whiplash because they thought it was totally sincere about the pronouns and the fragility of and it is, and yet this is compatible with this kind of
power. It was about power. So much of the left's social justice narratives have been about power and shaming, and using shame as a tool to exercise power over others. And what you're describing, this philosophical split, I have yet to find somebody to explain to me what happens when the oppressed are no longer oppressed. Are they still allowed to commit rape and murder with impunity, or is this just a function of their status within this hierarchy? Another point to add, is this hierarchy going off that? Is it immutable? It seems to me like the left casts a bunch of characters, and no matter what happens, that cast doesn't change. If you look at the size of the Arab world compared to, which is in billions, compared to the millions of Jews, it's utter nonsense to look at that and say, well, yes, the tens of millions of Jews are oppressing close to 24 countries in the Muslim world. I mean, that's insanity, right? But yet this is how the left operates. This is how the left thinks. These oppressor and oppressed classes are immutable. They're fixed. They're non-responsive to change in circumstances, consequences. They're usually tied to either some historic event or to some racialized lens, especially in the United States, that has been projected and superimposed outside the United States. And it's completely dysfunctional, because I go back to the original point. I mean, what kind of world are you creating if you say that once, the oppressed are allowed to commit all of these certain acts, which we'll get to the question of whether that's actually, that there's actual oppression being done by Israel. I would disagree with that concept, but let's, just to play with their premise for a bit. What happens when the oppressed population is no longer oppressed? Are they governed by a different set of standards? Do we expect them to behave differently than we expect others to behave? I don't know, because right now the expectations are zero, right? I mean, you can have hundreds of thousands of people coming out in the streets showing support for rapists and beheaders, right? Because they're not held up to any standard. And that's what the left has created. Who wants to live in that world? I certainly don't. And they don't really have an answer to that. They live in a static regime.
It's interesting. There is this projection going on here, like, and the more that I think about it, it is this like inappropriate projection of an American racial narrative and structure, which is incorrect in the United States, as the left advances it, but is nonsensical as applied to other situations. So, because you talk about projected ideology, this does seem to me that what you just laid out does seem to me to be the pattern of thought on the left, for example, with regard to crime, right? That if you're poor and a racial minority and you're oppressed, you can't be held responsible for immoral acts. In fact, and the way that, for example, murders in Chicago, which are one young black man killing another young black man more often, many more often times than not, right? And that is in the same way as what's happening in Syria right now, or the fact that Egypt is closed their side of Gaza as well. Like the fact that actually the only oppressions or deaths that matter, right, are those imposed by Israel against Palestinians, right? Because the real it's not if it were really just about, even forget about any life, right, but just about Palestinian lives, right, there would be more outcry when the aggressor is not Israel. But instead we only see this when the aggressor, and again, I'm going with the premise that you're I don't think Israel is the aggressor here. I don't think any other country on the face of the planet, having suffered these kinds of devastating and savage attacks, every single country would launch a response that was at least equal to what Israel is doing, and probably more, because they would not be as restrained by the international community, right? If there was a Comanche equivalent raid coming across from Mexico, and in comparable terms, I think it's something like 30,000 civilian deaths, right, from raids coming in on the Mexican border, we would already be sitting in Mexico City. Right.
We'd be
it's simply not tolerated. You can't tolerate as an entity. But leaving that aside, like this projected theory of this hierarchy in which if you are the poorer, the browner, whatever stupid heuristic that the left has, you are not morally responsible for your actions. It is kind of a projection of that. And it reminds me of when Whoopi Goldberg actually defended her against the charge she was anti-Semitic. I said she's just an idiot. But when she was talking about the Holocaust, right, where she was like, oh, it can't be racial because both sides are quote unquote white, like as though the only dividing line in the human universe is this black white divide in this particular history in the United States, right? Like, and it does feel a little bit like that, right? And there does seem to be some similarity between the excuse for like crime and violence perpetuated by people on the oppressed side of the spectrum in the United States. Well, that's okay because they're reacting to their oppression, right? And there's no sort of moral agency applied there. Whereas, and so I don't know, there is something similar. I think there is something projected out from that context.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what makes it even stranger in the context of Israel is that the majority of Israel's Jews are not European. They're from the broader Middle East. And so you have, they're descendants of Iraqi Jews, Moroccan Jews from North Africa, Algerian, Tunisian, Afghan Jews. So it's the idea that you have sort of these European colonizing power living in the Middle East and subjugating its neighbors. That's not accurate. That's not a representation of what Israel is. And even if Israel were, majority European, it still wouldn't make what's happening acceptable. But in the left's mind, they need this bifurcation. They need this racial binary in order to understand the world, because it's the framework through which they are able to assign good and bad. And it makes it easy. I mean, if you think about it, it makes it easier for them because it doesn't really require any nuance. It doesn't really require any intellectual engagement. It just requires you to kind of look and look at one photograph, arrive at a determination, and then that's it. And then you feel sort of morally empowered by it. And again, it's as we were talking about before, it's like impervious to any sort of nuance, change in circumstances, actual dynamics. I mean, what we saw what we saw from Hamas is exactly the type of behaviors we saw from ISIS. And it's very extremely troubling to imagine a world in which these individuals from Gen Z and millennials from our generation may one day be running administrative agencies and applying this same distorted, flawed logic to world conflicts. I mean, would there have been sympathy for ISIS when we were sieging Mosul? And would that have would this have been the type of thinking that guided foreign policy when we had our war in ISIS? I hope not, because the world is not safer. The world is not a safer place when these types of paradigms are superimposed and projected around the globe. I mean, they certainly aren't working in the United States, leaving that aside, but then trying to export them abroad, it's completely insane. And I think that at this point, I don't have an answer for kind of how do you rid that sentiment from the universities. I think it's a function of a lot more boomer professors hiring progressive professors, and these progressive professors being able to run roughshod over various departments. I think it's a function of U.S. immigration policy post 9/11. I think there's a lot of factors at play, but they've definitely intersected into something really awful that, frankly, we're going to have to deal with now, and deal with in a meaningful way. This isn't going to go away. This is only going to get worse. What's driving these campus protests? It's anti-Semitism, but it's also anti-Westernism. These are not people that love America. These are not people that love the American project. We have a serious crisis of transmission of values. And if we're a country of values and a country of ideas, then that's obviously in some ways existential, right?
Yeah, it's the illegitimacy, the implied illegitimacy of Israel in the Middle East. And yes, you can make all the sort of factual caveats that you did, but the frame is still the same, right? Yes, these are actually not, and some of it is simple ignorance in the sense that there are more Ashkenazi Jews in the United States. So like there's a projection that's the ethnic or demographic makeup of Israel when it very much isn't. But the illegitimacy doesn't change. And there is this concept by which only the most recent, and that's why what makes it more like you say, more anti-Western, more anti-European, and specifically anti-Jewish than it does this general, because where do you start the clock? Like we were talking about the Comanche, right? The Comanche were on the land that the U.S. conquered the land from the Comanche, but the Comanche conquered it from a different tribe, right? And before then, another one. And, you can go back to mitochondrial Eve in this way, that this whole concept of when did we start? So in Israel, it's very clear, right? When do we start the clock? Like if you go back to ancient Judea, then it's the land of the Jews. And then, there's some intervening. There was the funniest part about this, of course, is that Islam is a conqueror's religion. Like it's all written there. That's a history of conquest, right? That actually went all the way up to the gates of Europe. And into the gates of Europe often, right? The history of mankind is a history of conquest, and where you start this clock, it seems rather to just be a cover for this hierarchy, whereby certain people. I was laughing when you were saying before, laughing to myself when you were saying it's an easy heuristic, right? I don't know if you ever saw the Family Guy episode where it's Peter going through the airport, and the guy just holds up a Pantone selection of skin tones next to him. He's like, okay, good, you're not a terrorist, right? Because he's white, and it's just a selection of which of course was never true in the United States, right? Ever again. But it wasn't true. Total slander happening against the United States now. Completely. When they're recalling the post 9/11 period, and there are many things that I think the United States made mistakes about in after 9/11, but this casual reference that I'm hearing all over media to, we remember what happened to Muslims in the United States after 9/11. What what happened to Muslims in the United States after
Yeah.
9/11? I feel like the
Yeah.
United States bent over backwards. I'm not saying there weren't nasty remarks
is.
thrown
Yeah,
about or
absolutely.
something, but there was no mass spate of hate
Profiling
crimes
campaign.
or
Yeah, there
violence
was
or
none of that.
reprisal.
In fact, yeah. I was gonna say, in fact, TSA, I think, went out of its way to make sure that people knew that there was no profiling taking place before you were getting on the airplane, that sort of thing. Like, I think, to your point, you definitely always can find isolated incidents of things happening. But, as the hate crime statistics show us, like the vast majority of hate crimes in this country are committed against Jews. And it's been that way for quite some time. And so I didn't mean to interrupt you on that point, but I
Oh,
just wanted
no.
to confirm
I
your
was
your
on a
analysis.
tangent. Yeah,
Confirming your
no,
diagnosis.
yeah. No, I mean the more important point, besides what happened to and whether there was profiling in airports, is this illegitimacy applies to the United States. This presumed illegitimacy applies to America, European countries, Israel, all of the Western countries, all of one might say all of the white countries may be accepting Russia. I'm trying to think of how they would fit Russia into that heuristic, given the fact that he's now like their association with Donald Trump is too much for them now. Again, stupid projection of that makes absolutely no sense and has no basis in reality, right?
Yeah.
But they are trying to it does come more down to that, like the countries that are presumed illegitimate and their occupiers and colonializers. That includes the United States. It's not just about and it's pretty clear. And if they're legitimizing violence, this is not warfare, right? This level of sort of savage violence. The implication that it is a real implication. I don't want to go too far afield or seem too hysterical, but the real implication is it's okay to do violence also in America for the sake of revolution. And I think that was really brought home to me. Another sad incident this week. They hadn't yet publicized until recently what had happened to this Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, which, by the way, was absolutely beautiful, like a real work of art. Even aside from the political symbolism involved, it's those two statues. My family lives in Charlottesville, and I went to law school there, and it gave the city a real kind of lovely European feel, actually. That there was this Lee statue, there's a Stonewall Jackson statue in an adjoining square. That one's also, I don't know what happened to that one, but it's gone. I hope they didn't melt it too. I'm sure they did. And then the most silly thing was there's the statue of Lewis and Clark, the explorers that headed out west to see the Pacific Ocean. So it was Lewis and Clark, but then at their feet, Sacagawea is crouching, and she's clearly like tracking something, right? Like,
right.
And that was the concept of the statue, was here she is like sort of leading them the way and tracking certain things. But of course the interpretation was, oh, she's like kneeling in front of them, or she's lower than them, right? So they took that one down as well. Again, all three of them as works of art, just beautiful, really well done, and like things that we don't see much anymore as public displays of art that are usually much more hideous. Anyway, so they melted this Lee statue down and they filmed it, and they're turning it into something else. But it was almost sort of ritualistic, right? Like they wanted to film it, they wanted to like, and it's hard not to see that as a like a kind of warning, right? About about regime change and about what will happen when the decolonization reaches the highest levels of, I don't want to say reaches American shores, because I think it's already here and has been here for a long time, but when it reaches its full strength here.
Oh yeah, well, history is full of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then some gray areas in between. And the idea that we address history by just destroying it seems to me counterintuitive. It's also doesn't really pay homage to the fact that history is complicated. And in these types of situations where you were saying they created kind of this I would almost say propaganda video out of melting the statue, right? And kind of the stomping on the ashes of history in some way. It just, when you start going around and taking down statues, it never stops. It will never stop. That's the grim reality, is that there's no limiting principle. And it may be Lee's statue melted this week, but next week it could be George Washington. And in fact, there have been calls, if I'm not mistaken. Do you remember this? That there were calls to remove George Washington's statue at one point. I mean, they're going after not just Confederate figures, but also the founding fathers, who also have complicated personal lives and have complicated histories. And I can understand why people at least feel like, again, there's just no limiting principle to this. There's no limiting principle to when they start taking down statues. And for those of us who were opposed to taking down statues, I know you were, and I was myself, when they started this push, I would say, what was it, like 5 years ago? I knew as soon as this happened that, in 10 years, we're going to be lucky if George Washington University is still called George Washington University. And I mean that. Like, that sounds crazy and that sounds radical, but it's not, because you're right. It's not about taking down, quote unquote, bad figures. It's about going after the entire history of the United States. And that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, I mean, they've already dropped the Colonials as the mascot from George Washington University. No, I mean, they already have gone after. So there's a church in Alexandria where both Washington and Lee at different times, obviously, attended. They have plaques memorializing that. They took them down, both of them. Yeah. My husband has this book called The War on History, which everyone should read. But I mean, he predicted even down to the actual statues that came down. So he wrote that in 2018. And in 2020, nearly every statue that he wrote about in that book came down. But
your husband's in good company, because Alan Bloom, in The Closing of the American Mind in 1987, also said something along those lines too, that we can't identify the good any longer because of moral relativism, cultural relativism. And so we're just going to start tearing things down in the process, because we don't know what the inherent good is anymore. Everything is equal but different. And so we don't have things in society that we revere any longer, because we just see everything as equal but different. And then whoever is in power will just start tearing down pieces of history one by one.
Yeah, I mean, there was this sort of consternation on the right, as there usually is when the left advances something and the right kind of can't bring it itself to really just stand firmly in the breach, and they kind of like equivocate. The same thing happened with because these are Confederate statues, right? And Jarrett was writing about it back in 2016, and he actually had a debate in Breitbart News with Timothy Sandifer, who's was then at Pacific Legal Foundation. I think now he's with Goldwater. But you have to realize they don't make any distinction between Jefferson Davis and Thomas Jefferson. Like, we can have this academic debate about whether it was appropriate to put up statues to the generals of a defeated faction of the Civil War, right?
Right.
I think it's an interesting debate. I still fall on the side of, I think it's fine to leave them up. I think the context, and Jarrett writes a lot about this in the book, but in the context of it, what a lot of these statues went up contrary to, like, they sort of cherry picked the 2 or 3 people who spoke at what were very like large dedication ceremonies that had like these sort of extremely racist sentiments, like for real, extremely racist sentiments. They cherry picked a few of the things, but the reality is that most of these statues went up exactly on the 50th and 75th anniversaries of the war. They were attended by veterans of both sides, right? Think about how we now relate to World War II veterans. And that's how that generation related to the Civil War veterans. And in fact, these allowing the South to have some pride in itself in the 50th mark of the war or the 75th mark of the war, I think was very much in the spirit of Lincoln famously played Dixie, the day after Appomattox played Dixie in the White House, right? Like we
Right.
had this terrible, bloody and cataclysmic civil war that was necessary. And I'm not a lost causer, so I think the war was fought over slavery and all of the sort of attendant spinning out of all these other factors that were at play, like tariffs and different interests and so on, all looped back into slavery. But the idea that like we should have squashed the South out of existence, right? Like ignores. It's a very easy moral garbage, really, to be like, oh, we should have just like obliterated the South, our own countrymen who we fought, right?
Mhm.
And we should have crushed them. Like, how do you think that an entire section of like of the United States was going to continue to function? Like, did you want low levels of rebellion and warfare for the next
Right.
100 years? Like, this is the sort of thinking that this has no contact with like the compromises that made in politics and reality. And so in that sense, I actually like, without referencing to the just the slippery slope, even aside from the slippery slope argument, I think that it's fine and appropriate that Southern towns, put up, especially if they're putting up statues to people like Lee, or Stonewall Jackson. Obviously, first of all, both those men, they're commending their skill as commanders.
Right.
And second, like Lee really did spend most of his life after the war, like trying to prevent the kind of low level rebellion, like saying, no, we fought the war, we lost. Now it's time for us to be Americans. And
Lee in
who knows
particular is a
what
unique
would have
figure.
happened without his influence, honestly, like because he
Yeah.
was so influential. He had anyway, it's hard to read Lee's biography and come away thinking like, oh, this is like a unequivocally condemnable
Figure.
man. And anyway, I think it's fine that southern cities honor their generals in that war. They're the only part of America that knows what it's like to be conquered, which always strikes me, having family history and so on in Poland, right? That there's a certain parallel there, like that the South knows what it is to be like it was their cities that were burned in the war, and their land that was just taken back, right? So anyway, I think these things are not treated with any seriousness, but even laying aside that entire question of like, oh, is it appropriate to allow statues of a defeated general that fought against the United States? Like, I can understand why people would say no, but it doesn't matter because the second they're done with the Confederates, they come for everyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not even, you said 10 years. It's not even that. They immediately did.
Yeah.
They immediately did. Right. It immediately slipped from, and I'm waiting for Thomas Jefferson to go in the university that he founded, in this statue that stands in front of the rotunda at University of Virginia, right?
It's a matter of time.
Students once saved from fire, like risked their lives when the rotunda was on fire to take out the statue of Thomas Jefferson because it was so meaningful to the school to be founded by Thomas Jefferson. I'm just waiting that the statue gets defaced all the time. I'm just, waiting for them the administration to fold and take it down and probably melt it into something horrifying.
Well, something you said earlier about how these statues came up at like the 50th and 75th anniversary, there's something meaningful in that, right? So you remember at the time of the Civil War and even prior to the Civil War, people were very much invested in federalism and primarily saying, I'm from Virginia, not from the United States, I'm from Virginia, or I'm from North Carolina. There was very much a state identity. And then post-Civil War, I think Americans started to see themselves as being from the United States. And then, obviously that coincided with the eventual growth of the federal government and seeing, the United States as kind of a monolith and less of this regional loyalty. But the fact that these statues still came up, 50, 75 years later, it shows that that's not a recapturing. It's not like there's a reversion to this regional loyalty or a reversion to kind of resurrecting the sentiments of the Confederacy. If anything, I read that as like, we have a complex history. It's nuanced. We're Americans now. The war is done. The war is over. The North won. And this is a piece of our history. I think that there's a lot of people who are willfully misreading those statues as a sign that there are individuals who want to quote unquote resurrect the Confederacy. If anything, that gap in time combined with the fact that people identify themselves as being from the United States, very rarely do you see kind of that regional loyalty that you saw pre-Civil War. That in and of itself tells me, to your point again, that this is, if anything, representative of the South's complicated relationship with its own history. And the idea that we just go around tearing down statues instead of kind of recognizing that, I think is very odd and bizarre, and it's unbecoming of a sophisticated Western society, frankly.
It's also unbecoming of victors. Look, the people from these regions of America fill the ranks of the U.S. military by far, right? So they obviously don't have a continued allegiance to the defunct CSA, right? Their children are the ones who landed in Omaha Beach, right? Largely, I mean, and actually that was more mixed than many because of the broad draft, and it was really everyone. But if you look at like the composition of the U.S. military for the last 80 to 100 years, it's overwhelmingly two states, Texas and South Carolina.
They love the United States. They love the United States. Yeah.
So I mean, there is something. There's the South had more of a warrior class than the North. The North won the war the same way America won the war in World War II, with sheer production and wealth, right?
Power. Yeah.
And I'm not downplaying, like, obviously they did find a great general in Grant and but it took them some time. They didn't have this like natural sort of martial class that the South had, and that martial class essentially went and reintegrated itself into the United States and became our martial class again, America's martial class again, and that's a remarkable thing, given how bloody the war was, and I feel like there's no seriousness in it.
And the risk that wounds couldn't have been healed, and they were healed, and they were healed fantastically so, to your point about the fact that the military recruits so heavily from southern states. It is, people fight for the United States. They fight for a united country. And that's a testament to, not only that the North won the war and won it handily and rightfully so, but just the fact that there was an ability for each side to move forward. And I think the idea that the statues need to be taken down to move forward further seems to kind of fly in the face of the fact that we have moved forward. These statues exist for not the reasons that the critics believe they exist.
Yeah, and look, it's Jared and I were driving in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, and we saw a sign that said Civil War Museum. And so, of course, we pulled over, right? And it's this really small museum, and it is the last bastion of like the most lost causer people you could ever imagine, right? to the point. So, like, they were just playing Dixie. Like, it's let's say 3 rooms. It's a small museum, and it's just Dixie. And when it stops, it starts right back up again.
Oh gosh!
And it's just playing Dixie all the time. And it was, just really like lost causer stuff, right?
Yeah.
The war isn't about slavery. Anyway, but with lots of interesting artifacts and stuff, and it struck me because there are 2 old guys maintaining this place, and one of them has on his car the sticker that says "Dixie, still one nation under God," with a Confederate flag, and right next to it, he has a sticker, the U.S. Marines. And
the irony,
these guys were both I can't remember what the phrase is. They don't say it's not retired Marines because you're never out of it, right?
Right.
But
You're a
they
Marine
had both
forever.
served in the Marines, and it
Right.
really struck me like even the most hardcore Southern sort of attachment to this war, which again, the South might be the only part of America that's obsessed with history. Sometimes
Interesting. What makes you say that?
I think it says that's why I was wondering why. I mean, I think it does have something to do with being like conquered and
Okay.
in the North, nobody knows anything about the war, right?
That
The
is
war
true.
that
I
they
think
won.
there is a do you think though it's a function of I think the North too is full of transplants. It's also, I think there's more of an international flair to the North as well. And so you don't have as many people who feel like attached to the state in which they've landed, as opposed to like being born there, et cetera. So it's interesting though. I think you're right. I just am curious as to kind of I think your estimation that it's a function of being a conquered people is probably accurate. But I also think too there's kind of a cosmopolitan flair to the North that feels not tied to the land in nearly the same way that the South is.
I mean, I don't know if I think that's true. I mean, some of the most like, and I don't mean this as a pejorative, provincial people in the United States are in New England, I think.
This is also true. I take
But
offense being from Boston, but yes,
yeah,
there's a lot of people who never leave Boston.
no, I mean these regional cultures in the United States are really interesting. No, I do wonder because generally Americans don't know much about history in comparison to other countries.
Right.
And look, as much as that sometimes frustrates me, that there is an upside to it, which is that you cannot rally Americans to war based on something that happened in 1450, which is a normal and regular occurrence in large parts of the globe, right? What's the battle that Milosevic like was shouting about like in the 90s, right? Anyway, you can maybe the Balkans are particularly
like feisty.
no, and also in this like long list of historical slights, right? Ethnic and historical slights, and they remember every one of them, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
So there's an advantage in the sense that Americans are very, I think, mercantile, forgiving. They're not apt to like they're quick to Americans are quick to forgive, actually, like sort of historical. They go to war and then they come home and they start businesses and they move on. And the South is the exception to that, I think.
Right.
And maybe because it's easy to move on when you win.
It is, but it's also a function too, I think, to your point, comparing it to Europe, the borders were redrawn so many times. You as a Pole probably know that. So the borders get redrawn so much too, that there is this sense in which you're not permitted to move on because you're constantly being subjected to new borders being cast and having to kind of resituate yourself. And so to the United States' great credit, there's by and large, our state borders, once they became established and once they're no longer territories, et cetera, they were states. And that was pretty much it. And that's allowed people, again, to feel some sense of certainty that I think a lot of the rest of the world has not had the luxury of, through some fault of its own and no fault of its own. But that's a privilege, I guess, to borrow a term from the Gen Zers now. It's a privilege we've had in the United States.
Yeah, and this whole war, both in Ukraine and in Russia, and in Israel, has really brought home a number of natural advantages that the United States has, and for cultural reasons are throwing away. Right? Geography still matters very much. The fact that we have oceans on two sides and one corrupt but not particularly hostile power to the south, and a friend, as much as I make jokes about Canadians, to the north, right? These are and the fact that we are such a huge country, there is no force on earth that could actually invade the United States.
No,
not really.
They could
Even
attempt
the
it.
whole rest of the world, I think, if every single country decided to turn against the United States. I don't think that the U.S. like piece of land is a conquerable country. I know.
Let them invade California first. They're gonna kind of, if they're choosing which coast to land on.
What's the line from Dr. Strangelove? There are parts of New York, General, that I wouldn't advise you to try to invade.
Yeah, exactly. I probably would not start with Queens if we're picking boroughs of New York City to not invade first. It would
definitely Manhattan. Definitely Manhattan.
Yeah, go for Manhattan first. They're gonna crumble like a deck of cards. But Queens, Staten Island.
Yeah. No, but this is an enormous advantage that the United States has. But to sort of the conversation, to wrap up the conversation, it allows us, I think, a certain separation from reality that like a country like Israel just simply cannot continue in this equivocating delusion about themselves. At some point, you have to take your own side in a quarrel. And Israel, as it has been reminded, and all of us have been reminded, does exist in this extremely precarious geographic position all the time, that the threat of actual annihilation is there all the time. And every time they forget it, they're reminded.
Correct.
In the worst possible way. Whereas we can go on forgetting, I think, for a very long time, even as the entire geopolitical situation around the world changes against the United States and against our interest, and we're moving into seemingly into a more multipolar world, right? That the US can go on ignoring that and thinking that nothing really happens.
Yeah,
right?
There's no cost for our naivete. To your point, we can't really be invaded. There's no cost for our naivete. But there is for Israel. And they're not naive. And that's the reason they're not taking these demands for a ceasefire seriously. Because they know the costs of believing in universal values. They know the cost of believing that everyone values human life to the degree that they do. That isn't the case. That isn't the case in the neighborhood that Israel lives in. And they know, and they realize that.
Well, on that note, Erielle Davidson, you'll probably hear from her again. We're rotating people.
Yes, it's so much fun in this. I love this. We should do this again.
Yeah. So Erielle Davidson, you will hear more from her. You can find her on Twitter. I'm not going to point people to your legal work because it is more both technical and private. But you can follow her on, is it at Erielle?
Or just at Political L. I know I made it when I was when I was anonymous as a research assistant at Stanford. And so it's stuck with me now. So I haven't had the heart to change it. It's like when I adopted my dog and I kept his name that he got at the shelter. It's just, you just keep it. So yeah, it's at Political L-E-L-L-E.
So thank you, Erielle, for joining High Noon. And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org, including comments about the new format. Please help me out. And then please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.